Hello everyone, Rebecca here from Simple Suburban Living, and today I'm going to dehydrate this 3-pound bag of onions. Now, I don't expect to get a whole lot from them, but what I'm going to do is I'm going to cut these up and then I will show you how much they are in terms of the number of cups of diced onions that I have before dehydrating. I'll show you the process of dehydrating them and how long it takes. And then I'll show you how much I end up with, because one of the things that I love about dehydrating is that it almost always results in a reduction of the amount of space that the food takes. And it's also a great way to preserve food and keep it from going bad. So I'm going to be cutting these up and I'll bring you back when I have the onions cut up. So before I do that, let me just say that I'm going to coarsely chop these onions. I don't care about them being super fine. I like my onion fairly large pieces, and I'll show you that when I hit that point. Anyway, I thought that I would also just mention the number of onions that I have, because let's say that you had a bigger bag of onions, or you bought them loose or whatever. And sometimes it's nice to go by the number of onions, not just the weight. So I have here 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And you can see some are smaller, some are bigger, but I would just call them medium-sized onions. Okay, I take the onions and I peeled off the outer parts, including the outer layer, because that tends to be just a little, I don't know, I just don't really like that first layer. The texture is a little bit different and so on. So I do cut that off. And then I'm going to cut it in half. And I don't know if you can see the little core-like part. I like to cut that part out on each side. And then I'm just going to go across this way. And then this way. And again, I'm not personally worrying about them being real small. I'm just going to put them into my big measuring cup here so we can see what we end up with at the end. And I'll bring you back when all of them are done. But by the way, I just want to mention, see, I have all these scraps. I'm not throwing them away. These are going to go into my compost. All right, bring you back in just a bit. Actually, I wanted to show you this one onion. It doesn't look too good. That's one reason I wanted to get going on dehydrating these, because I'm afraid that I'm not going to, yeah, look at here. This, I've got a couple of layers here. And that sometimes happens. I've had this bag of onions for about 2 weeks. It would have been better if I got to dehydrating it right away, but it's going to be fine to cut off all of the bad parts and use it. But just wanted to show you that so that you could bear in mind that, you know, these were not a perfect bag of onions. So that's going to impact the final outcome. You can see this center part here. I got to make sure and get rid of that. Cut that out on both sides. So if you do have any bad parts, you just want to make sure and get rid of them, even if that means getting rid of a bunch of the onions. So as an example, I don't know if you can see, but that's kind of dark. I don't want that included. So I'm going to pull that out, and I will use this part of that piece, but I'm not going to use that part. Okay, here are all the cut up onions. You can see that they're very roughly chopped. I like using them in soups and stews and beans and things like that. I ended up with roughly 8 cups of onions, maybe just slightly under. So, but 8 cups is a good estimation of how much I started with them raw, and then we'll use that to compare what they end up with dehydrated. I have this whole bowl of scraps that are peelings and parts that I've cut off that will go into the compost pile. Now let's get them onto the trays. So I have 4 of these mesh trays, mesh screens to go on the trays. So I'm planning on doing the 4 trays. I could potentially just put them straight on here, but chances are they would end up falling through. So I'm just going to go ahead and use these mesh, and I'll do just a couple of cups worth on each of the trays, since I have roughly 8 cups of onions, and because no reason to make them be thicker. And I'll spread out, I'll spread them out, and then I'll add some on if I got them a little bit too spread out. And also, it doesn't hurt to break up some of the pieces that are together. It's not absolutely necessary, but they will dehydrate faster if I do that, if I go ahead and break up some of those. And by the way, these onions are pretty strong. You guys can't see me, but I am pretty teary. My nose is running and all of that. So probably for about the first 6 hours, I'm going to be dehydrating these outside because there'll probably be some pretty strong fumes. Now, if you're dehydrating something like green onions or onions that are not as strong, you may not need to do that. But since these are making my eyes water, and I really don't want to stink up the whole house, I'm going to just put them outside and dehydrate them that way. I can already see that I'm going to need to put these a little bit thicker than I did on some of these earlier trays, on the 2 first trays. So I'm going to add a little bit to them. And then I'll fill up the final tray. I'm actually thinking about getting a second dehydrator. I don't know how many of you have 2 dehydrators, but if you do, I'd love to hear if you find it really useful, if you use more than one, or if, like me, you have just one. I can kind of see the value of it, but, you know, then there's the issue of, obviously, it would cost me to buy a second one, and it would take up space. And, you know, so the question that I have is, do I really, really need 2? So that's something I'm kind of contemplating right now. I think the main reason I would want to have 2 dehydrators is because sometimes some of the stuff that I dehydrate takes quite a bit of time to dehydrate. And, you know, in the meantime, I can't dehydrate anything else because I've got my dehydrator full of whatever it is. Something that comes to mind is when I dehydrated just recently frozen berries and cherries. Those took basically 2 full days, almost. I mean, some of that time it probably had gotten dry and I was, you know, still sleeping. But during that time, I couldn't start anything else. So that's one reason, the main reason I would consider having 2 dehydrators. Okay, so now I'm going to take this outside, but before I do, I'm just going to show you what setting I'm going to put this on. So on my dehydrator, you can see it says fruits and vegetables 135. So I'm going to set this at 135, and I will at least take pictures about 3 and 6 hours in, and then I'll probably bring it inside at that point. Hello everyone. So it's been about 3 hours. I just came outside onto my patio, and let me tell you, I'm glad that I put this outside, because even walking outside here, I smell onions really strong. So I'm glad that they're outside, and I'll probably keep them outside for another few hours and then bring them in. But let's take a look and see how they're doing. Okay. You probably can't tell, but they're still extremely moist. I expected that though. So, but looking good. You can see that they're kind of shriveling up somewhat. And so I'm pleased with the progress that we're making on these. And I'll bring you back in about 3 more hours and we'll take another look. It's now been about 5.5 hours, but it's starting to turn dark a little bit outside. The sun's going down. So I wanted to come out and check these, and I'll probably bring them inside because I don't want to really leave them outside overnight. So, oh, they're starting to look good. They still have quite a ways to go, but you can see that they're definitely drying up. They're definitely dehydrating, starting to look good. And so I'm going to go ahead and bring them inside, and I'll check them again in a few more hours, and I'll let you know how they look at that time. I should add that when I walked outside I could still smell onions. So I'm definitely glad that I put them outside to dehydrate. But I think that they have calmed down enough, so to speak, to bring them inside and it not be a problem. And I just don't want to leave them out overnight. Plus we've had some rain just recently, and so it is damper outside than it normally is here in the desert. And so I think that they'll do better finishing up on the inside. Hello everyone, it's now been about 10 hours, or actually 9 hours, and it is almost completely dry. However, I do feel a little bit of moisture, and so I think probably within another hour or two it would be completely dry, and they smell wonderful. But I will probably go to bed before they're completely dry. So I am going to let them run overnight. It won't hurt anything at all to do that, and then by morning they should definitely all be really dry. And so in the morning I'll take you back, and I'll also talk a little bit about how you use the dehydrated onions. Thanks so much everyone. See you in the morning. Good morning everyone. And so it's now the next day. The dehydrator did run overnight, but I suspect that it probably was finished dehydrating within an hour or two after I went to bed. So I would put this at about the 10 to 12 hour time frame for them to be completely dehydrated. Keep in mind that I did have the dehydrator outside for the first around 6 hours, and it had been raining, and so it was a little bit of humidity in the air, and that may have impacted the time as well. So anyway, let's take a look now, and you can see, and you can probably hear, that they're nice and crispy. And I did look at each of the trays, including the bottom tray, before I turned on the video camera, and everything is nice and dry now, as you would expect. I'm going to go ahead and put the onions into this quart jar. I know it's not going to take the quart jar, but I'm just doing that for measuring purposes, so we can, because I'm not sure exactly how much we'll have. And so I'm going to just put them in, and then we'll compare to the amount of volume that the fresh onions took. Remember, I stopped the video for a minute to put the dug out, and I forgot where I was and what I was saying. So anyway, oh yes, we started at about 8 cups of onions that were fresh before the dehydrating process. So what we want to see is how much we ended up with after they were dehydrated. But while I'm putting these in the jar, I wanted to go ahead and talk about how you can use these dehydrated onions. And I want to say that first of all, the primary way that I use them is to just toss them into, beans or soup, something liquidy that I'm cooking, without rehydrating them, because they rehydrate in the liquid. That's the primary thing that I do with them. That's the primary way I use them. And then another way that I use them, or have used them in the past, I don't plan on doing this time, but grinding them into a onion powder. And if you ever give this a try and you compare the homemade onion powder to onion powder that you would buy at the store, you'll find the flavor of the onion powder that you make yourself is much more intense. You can probably use less of it. It definitely tastes better. So that's something that I would recommend. Especially if you ever end up with, let's say, 50 pounds of onions or that type of thing. Let's say you buy a big bag of onions at Costco, or All right, finally, one other way that you can use this is any recipe that calls for diced onions. Let's say, for example, you were going to fry up some ground beef with some onions in it. You would first rehydrate this, put some of the dehydrated onions in a bowl, put some hot water over it, and just let it sit for, 5-10 minutes. And then drain the water off and put them in whatever it is that you're cooking, such as the ground beef. And that is another way to use these. So there's really quite a few ways that you can use them. I find that especially if you like cooking with onions, I find this a worthwhile way to preserve onions. It makes it easier to use at the time. It takes the work to get them ready to dehydrate, but then when you're cooking, it's almost like a convenience food because they're already chopped and ready to go. Okay, so I've got a few little random bits and pieces that I'll have to pick off later, but for right now, I wanted to go ahead and just show you how much I ended up with. And let's see, so slightly less than 2 cups. And remember, we started with slightly less than 8 cups. So basically 8 cups dehydrated down to about 2 cups. So anyway, I hope that you found this helpful. I would appreciate it if you would like the video and if you would subscribe to my YouTube channel if you haven't already done so. Thanks so much, everyone. Have a great day.